I think there was a natural default to the deeper you go, the hotter it gets. And, when you're looking at geothermal, and it's all, everything that comes into that is relevant. So the deeper you go, the more pumping pressure you need, which means you need more parasitic load, which means the kilowatts you put in, you get less out, etc. So it's all about actually modeling it to get the maximum amount out related to what you put in and how that all comes together. So we've sort of built our focus around that, really, as how to build a model that's always the same.
Welcome to Geothermal Unleashed, where we will explore the cutting edge of geothermal energy. I'm Elizabeth Cambre from the Vallourec New Energies team, and I'm here to help educate and document geothermal's rise in the global energy transition. Today, we are diving into the inspiring journey of entrepreneurship with a guest who's carved his own unique path, Karl Farrow, the founder and CEO of Ceraphi, who's based in the UK. From challenges to breakthroughs, Karl has built an incredible career in geothermal that I cannot wait to explore with everyone. Karl, thank you for joining us. You've got a robust 40-year career with about 20 years focused on being an entrepreneur. You founded a number of companies, including Fabricom, Petrotec, Enermex Logistics, and more recently, Ceraphi in 2020. So can we start today by talking first about your entrepreneurship journey, the companies you have founded, the exit strategies, and then what guided you to the geothermal industry?
Hi, Elizabeth. Yeah, absolutely. Where do you want me to start? At the beginning?
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. Let's go through the different companies that you founded, how they built up upon each other, and then how that's kind of like giving you what you've needed to get into geothermal and to found Ceraphi.
Yeah, I mean, I left school with no real direction in sort of academic sort of aspirations. I was dyslexic at school. I didn't find that out till later on, but it was something that, obviously I knew was slightly different in that respect from a learning aspect. I was really good at practical stuff. I was art, music, these type of things. I used to play guitar, played in bands, and, I was very much a sort of arty sort of person. And I sort of fell into a trade apprenticeship, which really I initially started out looking at that from an aspect of, well, if I could learn sort of technical electronics and stuff like that, which were coming out at the time, I would then possibly be able to get into something like music and like as a music technician or something. But that never really came out. I ended up in a sort of pretty hardcore sort of fabrication world around oil and gas, which was building the company, building drilling rigs, and really from the age of sort of 18 straight offshore, working, really in the nuts and bolts of oil and gas as a sort of a qualified, coded welder, ability to fabricate this, that, and the other. And I, very quickly got into sort of supervisory roles and pushed into service jobs for the company I was in an apprenticeship for. And really forgot about all the other bits and aspirations I had about being a musician and all that sort of that, because I was earning good money and sort of driving forward with a didn't really look at it as a career, but it was just a good job and interesting job, getting to travel the world and see different things at a fairly young age and do a lot of things that most of my friends wouldn't even think about doing at that age because they didn't have the resources or the money. But one thing I did learn in there is, over a 4-year apprenticeship, that I wanted to be my own boss. I didn't really like the idea of, being reporting to somebody and, having that sort of chain around my sort of what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. And as soon as my apprenticeship finished, I more or less immediately started up a sort of self-employed fabrication business, which became sort of Fabricom. And yeah, started employing people, going around knocking on other, fabrication companies' doors, looking to ways of trying to do work for them. And the inroad I found was bidding on sort of lump sum piecemeal type projects. So, rather than going and ask for hourly rates, I would go in and say, give me a price for, or I'll give you a price for welding so many pipes or doing so much work in a tonnage sort of basis. And I managed to pick up quite a lot of work, and before long started employing lots of different people. And that sort of took over, and it became a sort of a fairly small, but sort of one-man band, two-man band, and then sort of grew into sort of like a small group of people working together, fabricating, and hired a fabrication unit and started to build off the back of that. At the same time, I also was sort of doing market stalls and running all sorts of other things at weekends, and I was still doing stuff related to my music. I had designing posters for nightclubs and bars and all sorts of stuff like that. So never really one for just doing one thing. I was always into all sorts of things, and it wasn't really about making money. I just enjoyed it. It's something I enjoyed doing. So the fabrication company was going on. I started then getting involved into bigger projects and involved in different stuff with bigger projects, floating in between myself going offshore whilst I had people working onshore doing other things in fab yards and doing other work. And I saw this guy one day with a effectively like an electronic theodolite, and I was fascinated with at that time technology and things like getting into the digital world as such. And because again, it was sort of, for me, it was about making things easier, and digitalization made that happen in some ways. So I started to get involved with this guy and understood that the dimensional control and surveying and leveling side, which I then took a course at college to learn how to do it, and went out and invested in quite a bit of equipment for sort of surveying and leveling, which actually got me into quite a few contracts with things like Canary Wharf and a few other big projects that we started to develop. And that was eventually then got to a point where we sold it off, and I moved forward with into something else. So I moved really from there into working in the oil and gas industry on some pretty good projects, and got involved in some fairly heavy projects overseas, deep water, projects mainly, as the industry was moving from onshore sort of shelf work to a more of a deep water offshore and even subsea stuff in the sort of the 2000s. And I fortunately got a contract with a project in Spain, working for BP, or working with BP through an agency on the BP Foynhaven FPSO. And the role I sort of got into was more like a topside coordinator role. So I started to manage all the interfaces between the various different bits of the ship sort of systems, and then the offshore process systems and controls. And it was the first time this sort of project had really happened at that sort of scale. There's been a lot of conversions, but not new builds, and lots of interface issues and issues around how to integrate ship systems with oil and gas process and all them sort of things. So and what I picked up out of that is and sort of applied is during my sort of surveying time with the other company, I also started to get into sort of an early stage version of what became sort of Excel and Word and Microsoft, and learn how to do databases and how to build up sort of systems. And so I started to apply that in the same principle on this project, and at the end of it, got to a point where we'd built quite a substantial, should I say, sort of project database that can control punch list items and control all the different areas and systems and subsystems of the project, which then I took into which became Petrotec effectively. And off the back of that, we built Petrotec, or Petrotec Group, which was effectively a startup sort of commissioning operations management company, using the software as a inroad at the early stage of project development. The software would then be sort of programmed and fulfilled with all the different items for the project. So literally starting with tag numbers for nuts and bolts and pieces of equipment and everything else. And we built that then into a sort of subsystems and then a systems type process, and then it became a complete package which would help the client and the user to hand over a project and get to a commissioning point without missing any points. Because one of the big issues in delivery of big projects is always punch listing and the long lead items and things that get delayed to move offshore to get projects complete. So we built up that, and we ended up over a period of 7-8 years getting the system into well over 50 projects across the globe, working with most of the major EPC companies, and also most of the big operators. So at that time, nearly everyone that was building an FPSO or some floating production system, we either had people on there using the system, or we had people on there helping them do the completion and carry over work, etc., and getting it to a startup. There's probably one or two companies at that time in the whole world that were doing it, and we were up there with them companies. That company was then integrated into Wood, which became Wood Group Commissioning Services as part of that process. And I ended up with a couple of years working in Wood as sort of an interface, or effectively projects interface director for Wood, covering a number of their projects across the globe. And then I left that side of the business in 2010. Planned to do an MBA, and because I felt I had a couple of businesses and really didn't have a piece of paper to show that I could actually run a business or do anything in business other than a sort of bit of a track record. And that was a bit of a turning point also in my career, because there wasn't much about in the sort of mid sort of 2000s, or sort of 2008, I think it was at the time. And MBAs were quite new. Food companies were doing sort of online stuff. There was one company I found in New Zealand which were doing a sort of it was New Zealand, doing a 6 month sort of like crash course where you'd actually go with an entrepreneur and it'd take you through the whole process, and at the end of it you'd get this MBA process. So I found this guy. I remember phoning this guy up and talking to him and running through basically what I'm doing now and what I've done, and he just turned around and he said, "You don't need an MBA, you just need to go and start another company," which is quite a sort of an endorsement in itself. So I sort of dwelled on that for a while and realised probably he was right, and if I did go and do this, it probably would have ended up and I wouldn't have finished it. But I didn't really know what I was going to do. Myself and my wife ended up moving to Mexico. We had an opportunity to move over there, and my wife was from Mexico originally, so we moved over there with not really a plan or a strategy. And I ended up then doing some consultancy work and working with Petrotec for a while. And at the same time, I'd already got quite a good reputation in Mexico from a number of projects that Petrotec had executed over there with Pemex, and had quite a good network of people that were in the sort of government and in the sort of higher leagues of Pemex, or moving into there. And I helped Petrotec get into quite well established into that structure. And at the same time, Mexico was going for an energy reform, and I was sort of pulled into that as part of the process, not sort of really knowingly or sort of willingly or even sort of trying to. It just sort of happened, and then became quite a sort of go-to figure in the sort of expat world of companies who wanted to get into Mexico because of the energy reform. So helping sort of the hydrocarbons commission to set up, and the energy regulators and various things all framing that process. So we'd learned quite a lot with the process of Petrofac of how to do the first sort of integrated service contracts. As the first company in nearly 70 years from an international basis that had ever worked in Mexico outside of privatization sort of group. So I'd learned a lot of the sort of challenges and the contractual frameworks around the SERPs and the various different contract agreements that were being put in place. So ended up having that knowledge and using that knowledge to help other companies get into the space, and ended up consulting with quite a few of them. And I established a company called Enermex, which then became sort of like a vehicle to effectively consult and work on that basis. But it also took me into doing all sorts of things, from trading petroleum to looking at minerals and mining assets in Mexico, and consulting for various different banks on due diligence reports and due diligence on restructuring sovereign debt and all sorts of stuff. And that was where I came across geothermal in 2016. I jumped onto an asset sort of management role, looking at some due diligence for refinancing some power plants with CFE, and two of them plants were geothermal plants. And I'd never really been involved with geothermal before. I knew what it was, but not really appreciated how connected it was to oil and gas, with drilling wells and holes in the ground, pipes and systems and everything else, and really just fell in love with it and just thought, why aren't we doing this everywhere? I've always been a bit of an advocate for the environment and everything else, and sort of was moving into a sort of transitional process anyway, naturally looking at other types of renewables and different things, sustainable, and fuels and all sorts of things. So when I saw geothermal, it just seems I was engrossed in it and just wanted to know more. Eventually, spreading out my wings to trying to find out other people in the industry, and found that there's very few of them. To be fair, I mean, it was a very small group of people back in 2016. When I started looking at this, and eventually came across Igor Kokish in GA Drilling, who was the founder of GA Drilling, who was developing this plasma technology in Slovakia. And after several conversations with Igor, he ended up persuading me to go to Slovakia and working with GA Drilling as their sort of chief commercial officer to help them commercialize their plasma drilling product, which I did in 2018. I spent a couple of years with them looking at taking their getting them funding, and also at the same time taking the plasma sort of technology to market, with a few different strategies. They weren't ready for geothermal then, but they were still developing the technology. But they had some technology which I felt could generate revenue through other areas, and we looked at some plasma milling, which is sort of like cutting production tubing type technology, and we were effectively going to field trials planned for around mid 2020. We'd just been on skiing holiday, came back from skiing around the end of February, and suddenly we were in COVID lockdown, and it was a case of survival mode. So we spent several weeks looking at how we could keep the company alive and afloat with the runway we had. Obviously, the field trials and questions around taking a risk of going to field trials 3 or 4 months down the road was really a decision that could have break or make the company, and I decided that it wasn't the right thing to do, which basically made me in a position where the commercial business was sort of put on the shelf and on hold. So I said to Igor, we should disband the team and just cut back all the resources we could in the business to try and just keep the runway as long as possible, which we did over a few months. So I went back to the UK in June, or just after June that year, and effectively sat there and just thought, well, what can I do now? And the only obvious thing to do in the middle of COVID was to shut up a geothermal company, which is what I did. So we established Ceraphi in 2020 in June, or just after June, and most of the colleagues that were working with me in Slovakia with the commercial team had obviously been laid off and got rid of. So as a sort of gesture of sort of goodwill and gesture of their sort of efforts that they'd already been working on geothermal, who better to bring into the business than the people I'd just been working with. So that's what we did. We sort of all got together and established the Ceraphi, should I say, company. Really didn't know what we were going to do at that particular time. I can't honestly say that we had a plan, because we didn't. I knew I wanted to do something disruptive, but also something that could be applied fairly quickly and not go into sort of fundamental R&D type stuff, which was going to take years to get off the ground. And I think COVID also done us in some ways, was a good platform to start when I look back, because everyone was sitting at home and we were able to get access to people and talk to people that potentially we probably wouldn't have done if everyone had been going around their daily lives as normal. So we were all working from home on Teams. We started to recruit people and grow the team, and we started to look at some innovation around closed loop and how we could mainly repurpose oil and gas wells was the big focus back then. It was we had a couple of people looking at the deeper geothermal stuff in, could we do monobore systems with deep geothermal? But we sort of quickly realised that the repurposing oil and gas wells was probably the lower hanging fruit that no one else was really looking at that particular time, and that's why even today, I think we've fairly much stuck to that model. Although we are looking at other drilled wells, etc. The repurposing side is something that's very much at the heart of our sort of go-to-market strategy and development strategy. And as a result of that, we've acquired several oil and gas sites, and we own our own assets and taken these off oil and gas companies as they come to end of life. And we've got 8 sites, 12 wells now, 42 kilometers of pipeline, and we're now negotiating for at least another probably 20 plus sites across the UK and elsewhere. So it's become sort of really now a sort of heart of the business, and really set the fundamental sort of should I say stepping stones around how Ceraphi was found and what we really stand for. I mean, we are very much a different company in the aspect that our focus is very much on heat extraction as opposed to power generation. I do believe that power generation will become a core part of our business in the future, but I think I also am watching the space between the energy extraction and the energy generation, because I think there's a big step change going to happen in that space over the next 5 to 10 years, where we're going to see a lot more innovation in the energy transition process, i.e. how do you transfer that heat into something like power or into something more usable? And I think that space is something that's going to change significantly.
So are you, I have a lot of questions, but from everything you said, but going with this, so are you talking about like ORCs, like
Yeah.
okay.
So we're seeing like a lot of, I mean, even today, personally, I'm outside, Ceraphi, I'm also invested in a couple of other companies, smaller ones that are dealing with some innovation in ORCs. And I think that space is something that, I would say watch that space, because I think this is something that's, that will be a step change. It needs to happen.
Yeah.
We use some power generation systems, steam turbines and that, because that's what's there. But, and we're trying to fit geothermal systems around, should I say, turbines and technology which were designed for higher temperature, offtakes, like using gas and things like this and burning gas. So I think, there's a natural question in my head that says why would we want to do that when we can actually try and adapt technology to fit actually lower temperature or empty systems. So I'm seeing a lot of changes in that space, and I mean, I'm already working with one startup who's looking to significantly sort of shake up that space in the next couple of years with, systems that can generate good efficiency with temperatures as low as 40 degrees. So
Yeah.
I think, I think it's a space that will help us going forward, and if we can focus our efforts on scaling heat as a commodity today in a sort of range between 40 and 60 degrees C, I truly believe that in the coming years that power will be connected to that in the same systems, and we'll be generating power to help their that micro, should I say, off-grid micro grid solution as such.
Okay. So to decide which direction I want to take my discussion in, because I have a lot of questions. But let's stay on the topic of Ceraphi. I want to learn more about your closed loop system. So there are a lot of startups that are in this space. So
Yeah.
how does Ceraphi differ in is it the downhole completions of extracting the heat that has like a differentiating? I know I saw you have
Yeah.
some patents. So how do you differ from the other startups?
I think there's two different differentiators when you look at us compared to others. I think we don't look at what we're doing as a system or a technology to sell. We are setting the company up as an energy company, and we want to sell kilowatts at the end of the day, whether it be kilowatts thermal or kilowatts neutrons. The other part of it is we've always looked at this as a system and an approach rather than just being a product or a service. So I think there's lots of things you can do to obviously maintain thermal extraction. There's lots of things you can do to keep thermal energy moving in the system. But what you can't do is change the physics of thermodynamics and properties, general properties around the sort of mathematics. And I think that's something we've learned in the last few years, or certainly the early few years of Ceraphi. Whilst power generation is doable at low temperature with a monobore system and with the approach we take, it's probably not the best use of the energy with the way we extract it. So we've tried to always keep a very simple approach to energy extraction, and we've, as I say, repurposing of wells, a monobore sort of pipe-in-pipe coaxial system has really been our approach and still is. We've also played with all the different types of should I say aspects of looking at thermal tubing and insulated tubings and different types of properties, and we've got various configurations that incorporate them depending on what we're trying to extract and what volume and how deep and all the other stuff. So there's a lot of science and maths behind the process, that it's not just a simple we've got one of these widgets and we stick it in a hole and we produce energy, because every single project really is in some ways is I wouldn't say bespoke, but needs to be configured to get the maximum value out of it. One thing we learned out of our demonstrator project we've done up in Yorkshire a couple of years ago now is that we've also set our sort of benchmarks and standardization around the depth you need to go in certain temperatures to get certain values out and properties. So I think there was a natural default to the deeper you go, the hotter it gets, and this, that, and the other when you're looking at geothermal, and everything that comes into that is relevant. So the deeper you go, the more pumping pressure you need, which means you need more parasitic load, which means the kilowatts you put in, you get less out, etc. So it's all about actually modeling it to get the maximum amount out related to what you put in and how that all comes together. So we've sort of built our focus around that, really, as how to build a model that's always the same and gives you the same properties all the time, rather than to go for, should I say, blue skies and sort of innovations that potentially you can get in the sites in the right geology in certain locations. What we want to do is create something you can get everywhere and get it anywhere in a certain package, and that's what I think Ceraphi is different. We've created something now which we know we can take anywhere in the world and get a certain amount of energy out of, and that can be then applied and multiplied and scaled in whatever values we need it to do to produce the energy required in that location. And also we're trying to focus on, I would say, an area which is lower hanging fruit, and also probably less of focus to the larger companies that are looking for megawatts and gigawatts. So whilst there are a demand for higher power generation in data centers, and there's companies building bigger infrastructure for that and looking at feeding data centers, there's also a huge market at the other end of the spectrum looking for off-grid, small-scale solutions in tens and thousands of them. So we're very much looking at that market where we can go into smaller communities, look at off-grid solutions, look at heating, cooling as being fundamental, working with innovative technology come around the corner for ORCs to produce power to keep baseload lights on around utilities and stuff like that, and also working with other types of renewables. So solar and battery storage is a great fit for what we're doing and stuff like that. So yeah, it's very much like we don't see ourselves. I personally don't see ourselves with a load of competitors around us. I think I like to look at most of the people around us. I look at collaborators. We speak to Evor and we speak to other companies. We've shared ideas with companies like Evor on projects and opportunities, and so we don't see competition in the same way as that probably others might do. I think that we're looking to provide an impact change to help the carbon removal part of the energy transition. Everywhere you look, it's got the same problem. So every building you look at has got needs an energy solution to help it in its energy transition. So there's more to do out there than there is companies to do it.
I agree. I mean, I think that there is such a huge market and there's room for everyone.
Yeah.
to be part of it, and everyone's success only helps move forward. Well, that's great. So is Ceraphi focused mainly on projects in the UK, or have you previously looked around the globe for various projects?
Yeah, so we still I mean we have we have an office in Houston. We've got a representation in the Middle East and also in South America, and we've also got a representation in Southeast Asia. But most of our initial stuff we were looking at, we'd start like most startups. You grab at straws. You do everything that comes through the door or try to. You
Yeah.
know, it's a natural reaction in many cases. Now we're a little bit more honed in and focused. Now we own our own assets in the UK. The sort of focus has become a lot more focused on the UK, on our domestic market, and trying to, I'd say, take that to a successful, go-to-market delivery strategy, whilst at the same time still looking at sort of cherry picking the projects we want to overseas. So we've still got projects we're looking at in Europe. We've still got projects we're looking at in the US and other parts of the world. But what we aren't doing, as we probably were before, is flying around the world, attending events, and doing selling the big sell stuff. We don't do any selling, to be fair, and haven't done probably for the last year and a half, 18 months. It's really now about protecting the brand, making sure the brand is doing what it says it's doing. Really delivering on what we've set out to do for our shareholders and stakeholders, and making sure that this we have a saying, saving the planet 1 megawatt at a time. Make sure that we're getting them 1 megawatts at a time into the business case to deliver them. And the other thing what we've done is we have a software system, which I think you were going to talk about anyway, but I'll bring it up now.
Okay.
We have a software system that we developed called Ceraphi Pro, a pro meaning project, and the idea of it was we felt that we needed something to go alongside a sort of plug and play scalable solution. So we've built a platform around sort of six fairly straightforward interfaces, really, that from start to finish will deliver a business case. So the interface one is looking at the location, interface two is looking at the geology, interface three looks at the well, interface four looks at the system, the topside, interface five looks at the system, and then interface six looks at bringing it all together and creating a business case for a CapEx and OpEx sort of solution over 25 or 40 years, whatever you want to sort of model it at. And what that's done is enabled us to effectively take all these projects. We've looked at well over 150 projects in the last few years around the globe, and we've been able to sort of capture that data because we've started. We're working with a lot of well operators and working with a lot of companies who want us to look at repurposing wells. We've been very fortunate to be given a lot of data, which we don't attribute it to the name, but we've got the geological gradients and the depths and the different formation calculations. So we've used it to validate our own model, but also be able to effectively validate what we've been told across the globe in certain locations. Certain things are, because even in the UK we found lots of anomalies in the historical British Geological Society stuff, where the thermal gradients have been certainly estimated on a borehole that might be 50 meters. Do the same old thing as just extrapolate that data, by kilometers, etc. Where in some cases that's not the case, where you've got certain geology that changes and certain geology that transfers heat differently.
I think that's kind of interesting. Do you think that when you have startups and they've got just this massive amount of projects that they have to evaluate, that this can make or break a company, if you don't really have the capability to narrow down and really focus on a certain project, because it takes so much work and you have to raise all the capital to get the project off the ground. And if you spread yourself too thin, chasing so many projects, that can really does it hinder you?
Yeah, I mean, every startup needs to raise capital, and raising capital is not easy in any business. And I think the more risk you can remove from that front end of sort of raising the capital side and look at a model which is effectively removing risk is going to be a benefit. I think everyone knows that the risk of geothermal is that unknown geology and the risk of exploration and the risk of, is there a reservoir there? Is there, so hence one of the other reasons we, as Ceraphi, looked at the closed loop approach is we were looking for heat rather than geology or a certain condition in the ground, meaning that
Right.
we know that systematically around the world, the average geology, and I'll probably get academics screaming and shouting at me now, but the average geology is 28, 30 degrees around the world on average, sort of per kilometre. But at the end of the day, if you work on them sort of assumptions, in the parameters in the world we live in, 1 or 2 degrees is not going to change anything. So we've worked on the assumption that every kilometre depth is, say, 30 degrees, and if you go to 2 kilometres, it's 60. If you go to 3 kilometres, it's 90, etc., etc., etc. And what that does is makes sense. It's something that investors can get their head around, and it's something that makes sense when you're doing business cases and models. So to be able to go to an investor and say, what we drill wells to, 1,500 meters and we extract 45 degrees temperatures, which go up to the surface, and then we create a network and we put a heat pump on it, and we sell energy to a customer at the end of the day. That's a very simple model and a lot simpler than going out and say, we want to go out and develop a project. We don't know where we're going to drill yet. We don't know because that's generally what happens when you're a startup and you say, well, I want to do a geothermal project. You have to go out and find all that information up front. And when you're drilling for I call it a bit like, the sort of holy grail being the
Right.
sort of the formations under the ground, which gives you natural, energy and volumes. It is a holy grail. It's something that's not everywhere. It's something that, you've got to be fairly lucky to come across something that's going to give you a resource that you can go and monopolize and cash in on.
Right.
And a bit like oil and gas, if we were going out drilling, 100 years ago, and everywhere we drilled, we hit oil, everyone would be a billionaire today, and
Sure.
unfortunately that's not the world we live in.
Yeah. So what has your experience been like raising capital?
So I mean, fortunately, I've done it before, and I think I think with raising capital, you've got to have more than just a good business case. You've got to have a story. I think where we probably differentiate and where we've differentiated a little bit in Ceraphi is that we've tried to do something a little bit different in creating. We want to create a business which has got a sort of legacy standing behind it, as something that can be built upon. I didn't set Ceraphi up just to sort of spin it and sell it and move on. We're trying to set the business up to be an energy company and something that is going to be game changing, and that takes a different investor. It's not a VC play. It's not an angel play. It's somebody who wants to come on that journey with you, and generally they're family officers or high net worth individuals and people that want to buy into that space. And everyone knows the last few years has been quite tough anyway to raise capital everywhere. So although we've been successful in raising capital, it's a never-ending journey. When people say to me, "Have you finished fundraising?" I think as an entrepreneur, you never stop fundraising. And even if you stop fundraising, you're not an entrepreneur anymore. So I think in some ways, you've got to keep fundraising, you've got to keep doing that, and you always come up with new ideas and things that you can add to the business model. So you're forever needing to look at different ways of gaining capital. I think the other thing that because we are focused around building that energy sort of ESCO model, sort of energy services company model, where we're supplying energy. What I found the difficult part is getting the money to do the projects easy. The money to take that from an idea to a solid business case, which is investable, is the money that most startups tend to not have, and that's the bit I find, or I think everyone finds, hard to get. So it's been able to track that, £500,000, 750 grand to £1 million, to sort of take a project from an idea and a piece of paper to a fully loaded project with planning permission, with all the authority and regulatory sign-offs, and with all the things. And that's the difficult part. And I think you have to be pretty much sort of I'd say a bit of a brave soul to go out there and try and do stuff if you've not got backers in that. And we've fortunately been able to find them backers and take some calculated risks in sometimes. We've taken over well sites that, others would look at as a liability of taking over wells. We look at it where we've got a hole in the ground and saved ourselves £3 million on drilling a well. So I think it's depending on where you sit in the frame of looking at the asset and looking at the business model, really depends on how you can then capitalize on that and sell it to raise capital to move forward.
Okay, so let's turn to your participation as chairman of the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association. I'm not very familiar with this association. Can you enlighten me?
Yeah, so we sort of around the end of 2020, when we'd sort of already got Ceraphi established, we were pulling together an advisory board. I pulled in Chris Sladen, who sits on our advisory board. He was a good friend of mine from Mexico, my days in Mexico, and he was the president of BP Latam over there at the time. He came back to the UK, and we connected one day and we just chatting. And Chris was a geology background, so pretty much fascinated in what we were doing in geology in the geothermal space and looking to do. And one of the things that we sort of both sort of said at the time was there was no real dedicated UK arm focused purely on sort of advancing geothermal from an advocacy point of view. We didn't look to set this up as an events organization or something that was going out to do memberships and all that. It was really a plan to build a advocating arm that could go and lobby government and go and take all the concerns that startups and businesses had in trying to get geothermal over the line and push it forward as a solution in the UK space and the global space at the time. So, we got a few stakeholders in the room, had a few conversations, and very quickly found that there was a huge amount of support for what we were trying to do. And we established, I think it was early 2021, we established GEA, the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association. First parties we had on board were companies like Halliburton and Petrotec and, UK oil and gas and quite a few large oil and gas companies. And very quickly had a very strong sort of board. We're now, I think, probably in the region of about 64 members. And they do range from across the globe. We've got so we have what we also wanted to do in GEA was break down the barriers of conventional sort of membership organizations. So we set up what we call ambassadorial groups. So we have global ambassadors that sit around the world, and they can be anyone from a student in a university to a CEO of a geothermal company. And what we did that for is actually because it was more about creating a bit of a think tank and a bit of a knowledge sharing base. So the global ambassadors groups meet every month, and like I say, they range from academics right through to companies in the industry, people selling equipment, and all sorts. And they'll meet in their different regions, and then we'll meet also generally together. And it's really a space to talk, collect ideas, share innovations, technologies, but we also created white papers. So we've created what we call special subject matter, which then get fed back to us in the board, and we then take them to the various governments around the world as problems. So, we've had inquiries of people trying to get equipment into Indonesia, or trying to release equipment from Kenya, or trying to move stuff, and about taxes and all sorts of things. And the idea is really to take them problems and try and help as an organization, break them down and solve some of them challenges in the space, as well as lobbying government, as well as working with select committee documents and papers and trying to educate policymakers and regulators in the process. And I think that's what has really come out of this in the last few years for GEA in the UK, is we have been influential in a lot of the common select committees and the various parliamentary decisions that are influencing regulation. We're continually being asked by regulators to get involved into workshops and stuff that's going on, review processes. Ceraphi ourselves now, we're probably one of the only companies in the UK which actually are advising NSTA, which is the regulator for the wells, on energy transition to convert wells from oil and gas to geothermal. We're now being asked in Holland to do the same in other areas. So it's really about, lessons learned and just sharing them knowledge about how it's done. I think it's good when sometimes it's good when you haven't got regulations and you haven't got framework to be able to have the ability to, I'd say, improvise in a safe manner, in a logical manner, to be able to create strategy and create approach that normally wouldn't probably get over the line if there wasn't that flexibility. So sometimes, although it can be daunting not to have framework and not to know what's next and what to do, it's actually sometimes a good place to be, to make sure that there aren't restrictions stopping you doing something that eventually could be a game changer.
Well, I love your energy and I love everything that you're doing in the geothermal space. It requires so much work to get this space lifted off into the future and for more commercialization projects. We are about out of time, so I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Carl.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
and I
Liz.
want Yes, and I want to thank everyone else for joining us on this episode of Geothermal Unleashed. I hope today's discussion has sparked new insights and deepened your understanding of the geothermal industry's incredible potential. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and let's continue working together to unleash the full potential of geothermal. Thank you.